noc.
It's been a brief night, but most disciplines are already back. So now we have the second day of the 18th International Dairy Cooperatives Forum. So we hope that you liked yesterday that lectures and discussions were really up to the point, and they showed the challenges that the dairy market faces in the future, and also you had about opportunities and threats of the European Green Deal. And I do hope that the evening was nice in the Nadavki cottage or inn, and yeah, I do hope that you have really very positive emotions now after yesterday's evening event, and I do hope that the energy now of yours would be enough for the panel, for the discussions to be held. So now let's have the first lecturer. So now it's session 3, which is about international trade and the consequences of free trade agreements. So now let us invite the first lecturer, Mr. Alexandre Anton, Secretary General of the European Dairy Association, and he will discuss a new EU trading strategy and what's ahead of the dairy sector. So, no.
Technician, help me out. In the training session this morning, it worked quite well. Voilà, ça marche, merci. First of all, dzień dobry and a very good morning. That's a challenge to be in front of you after a welcome evening that was late. So I appreciate that you're in. And I'm really honored to be in Białystok, the dairy capital of Poland, that has become, for the last 2 days, the dairy capital of Europe or of the world, the White Hill, as it is translated into English. And it's a real pleasure to be back in the Dairy Cooperatives Forum here in Poland. That is the first international dairy conference that is taking place in the analog space. So you are front runners here too, not only in dairy. And I'm a real big thank you, dziękuję bardzo, to Agnieszka for the invitation to be on that panel this morning on international trade, the effects of free trade agreements. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion with distinguished ladies from the embassies, from the Netherlands, from France, and with my co-panelists, Gabrielle and Chris from New Zealand. And that will be an interesting session, but I was asked to show many pictures because it's early in the morning. So I was not asked to be at the same intellectual haste than the discussion we had yesterday afternoon. And I have to say the discussion, the opening session and the second session, but especially the opening session yesterday, was an eye-opener. That was really interesting. I'm really grateful. That was a high-level panel. I have to say I'm surprised that when I think it was Sascha Siegel from EX who asked, raise your hands if you believe that the new European environment, the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork, is more a challenge or even a threat than an opportunity, as Commissioner Janusz Wojciechowski claimed. Only half of the public here said it is more an opportunity. It is more a threat than an opportunity. Frankly, I'm not yet convinced, but that is maybe just another sign of the vibrant energy of the Polish lactosphere. Now, a few words, if I may, to tell you where we are coming from as EDA, as the European Trade Association, when talking international trade. We connect the world of dairy as EDA, the European lactosphere. We are representing more than 95% of the milk processed in the European Union, processed, by the way, by both cooperatives and private companies. And we are proud of our 4 Polish member organizations. Still, 10 out of 20 top 10 dairies in the world are headquartered in Europe. We are the #1 dairy producer and exporter on the globe. And European dairy exports adds every year 10 billion euros to the positive trade balance of the European Union. With our European self-sufficiency rate of dairy of about 113%, International trade and a profound pro-trade attitude is enshrined in the DNA of European dairy. And here in Poland, and that is your state secretary who claimed yesterday, you produce around 23% more milk than you consume in Poland. So you have a self-sufficiency rate of 123%. So you are really heavily exposed to dairy trade within the European single market and around the globe. And back in 2018 at the International Dairy Cooperatives Forum in Serotsk, my then president, Michel Nallet, from a small family dairy in France called Lactalis, he highlighted that our European dairy success is based on three fundamentals. It's a well-functioning EU single market, it's a supportive common agricultural policy, and it's an ambitious European trade policy. And that is a picture taken in 2018. I think many of you have been there, and my president, Michel Nallet, has been here very often. By the way, we have a new president with Giuseppe Ambrosi. We have since March 2021, one of the finest Italian cheesemakers, Giuseppe, and he's supported by a team of 3 vice presidents. We have the CEO of the biggest cooperative in Germany, the biggest dairy cooperative, Ingo Müller. We have with Mr. Peter Gertz-Carlsen, the CEO of Arla Foods, another cooperative who's in charge for the European business for Arla. And we have from the private dairy side, Mr. Jan Tepli, the owner of Madeta in the Czech Republic. And I'm proud to announce, as of 1st of October, we will have Pavel Pasternak from Lekpol as a board member at EDA. And I use that opportunity to say hi to Frédéric Chausson, another board member of EDA here in the room. You've seen that slide before, but it's important to recall ourselves as a dairy sector, what we all represent. We, the European dairy sector, of which the Polish Lactosfera is a vibrant and integral part. We are the economic backbone of rural Europe and beyond. We have 12,000 processing plants across the Union, and with more than 300,000 jobs in the milk processing industry, of which 45,000 jobs are directly linked to dairy exports. And we are partnering with about 700,000 well-trained and committed dairy farmers that are suffering right now and will suffer under the Green Deal if we don't get that right. Still today, we have a home market in the European Union, in the single market of 450 million consumers, and we have a deep global dairy footprint and pro-trade attitude. So our industry as a whole has a vital interest in international trade and trade agreements. But let's put things in a relative perspective. And I took the example of New Zealand because we will have Chris Carlson from the New Zealand Embassy later on the stage. When we all together claim the importance of milk and dairy for Europe and the European Union, we have to keep all macroeconomic relations right. The EU dairy sector, well, the EU agricultural sector as a whole, the whole EU agricultural sector accounts for 1.5% of the European gross domestic product, GDP, of the whole European economy. The whole agricultural sector, 1.5% of the European economy. So dairy is far less than 1% of the overall European economy. While in other parts of the world, and I took by coincidence the example of New Zealand, in New Zealand, dairy sums up for 10% of the national industry. And this figure, the 1% figure, defines the priority position when public authorities discuss free trade agreements with each other. So we as a European, as a Polish dairy sector, must make our point in the political arena if we want to be heard. Because after all, we are less than 1% of the overall economy. And that is, by the way, visible. I'll come to that point later on. Because yes, indeed, the international trade agreements of the European Union, the competence is with the European Union. It's not with Poland, it's not with France, it's not with the Netherlands, it's with the European Union. That means that the European Commission is the one negotiating with third countries like Australia and New Zealand, but it is not the bureaucrats in Brussels and in the European Commission that decide on the trade policy, on the trade strategy of Europe. It is the European Union That is, the Council and the European Parliament. In other words, your 52 Polish members of the European Parliament and your Polish ministers in the Council are part of the cockpit crew in international trade negotiations in this world. And now, in 2015, and I talked, I think on the conference in 2016, we had that as an issue, the European Commission published its Trade for All strategy that really changed the overall approach of the European Union. Inspired by some frontrunners, not least New Zealand, to quote one, the European Union shifted away from focusing on WTO, World Trade Organization, multilateral approach, and finally focused on bilateral trade agreements with huge energy and success. The former EU Commissioner for Agriculture, Phil Hogan, traveled the world in 12 high-level missions to open up new markets. And in his delegation, there was always a member of the Polish lactosfera, like here in 2018 in China with our friend Agnieszka. The global landscape from a European perspective changed significantly. Here you see two slides, 2016, 2021, the overview on trade agreements. I do regret not only the landscape shape, but also the communication and presentation layout of the Commission changed, so it's less comparable. That's why this is what it says you. Since 2015, we have now in place free trade agreements with Canada, Japan, and regrettably with the United Kingdom. We would have preferred not having a free trade agreement, but having them in the Union. And we have others, Ecuador, Namibia, you can see them on the list, that are of less, let's face it, less important for the European dairy. Under ratification, though, finalizing the negotiation process, it's under ratification. Mercosur, and I guess Gabriel will talk about it from a Spanish perspective, India, Vietnam, West Africa, including Nigeria, East Africa, including Kenya. So these are really destinations for dairy. And we opened up negotiations with Indonesia, Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand, and I guess Chris will talk about that later on. And free trade agreements are instrumental for all of us. I copied that slide, and I do apologize, it ends in 2018, but I copied that slide from a January 2021 presentation of the European Commission. What it basically shows is that the Polish agri-food industry export half of its production value, mostly within our European single market, but 13% go to countries outside our union. And let's face it, when it comes to the single market, when it comes to the European Union and our single market, there are still some shortcomings in its functioning. And we see a certain rise of protectionism and protectionist tendencies in the political arena. And I don't remind you about the story of the blacklisting by the Ministry of Poland back in March 2020, sorry. But let's be very clear. All the export managers in your companies and here in the room can confirm, when you are in the business of selling Polish milk and dairy within the Union, Germany, France, within the single market, this is a pretty easy game compared to selling to third countries. Just to give you a flavor here, for third country exports, just over the last couple of weeks, we're talking the last 4 or 5 weeks, we've seen a number of trade barriers popping up for milk and dairy. And that is something where I'm learning. I didn't know that the Qatar market is of such importance for quite some small-scale dairies. And they just out of the blue popped up with some labeling requirements for milk and dairy and shelf life requirements for milk and dairy delivered to Qatar that basically forced you, if you wanted to fulfill the contracts, to switch to air freight. And you can imagine what that means for the margin of your products. So we have, as soon as we don't have a free trade agreement, so the golden standard is of course the single market. There you basically don't face big problems in the marketing of your products. When you have a free trade agreement, the problems start. They are not known, but if you don't have a free trade agreement, like with Qatar, then you're really not safe in your contracts. So what we did, and there I have to make kudos to the competent services in the European Commission, because with Qatar we were in contact with the EU delegation in Qatar and with the Commission to solve that problem. And we have not dozens, hundreds of those so-called SPS TBT issues popping up every year. And these issues don't disappear with a free trade agreement. We've seen that with the United States, where we don't have one, but we've seen that with other countries. Canada, for instance, we have a free trade agreement, and we have issues with Canada, but free trade agreements, overall, they deliver. And if you have a look at the free trade agreement and the cheese category, and I'll come back to cheese later on, the figures are simply impressive what happened over the last 5 years. You can't read it probably, but what this slide tells you, when you add up all the tariff-free quotas for European cheese exports through free trade agreements that have been agreed on, you get to a figure of 210,000 tons. 210,000 of European cheese that goes out in the world tariff-free. And that is without the UK. So this is 1/4 of the overall Polish cheese production, by the way. Talking about the Polish cheese production. Hey, you are number 6 in global cheese production. Can you imagine? For all I know, this is in volumes, because in value there seems to be a bit of a shortcoming in the Polish cheese cheese industry, but in terms of volume, you are number 6 in the world. And you, I'm sorry, Caroline, to tell you, Caroline from the Embassy of the Netherlands, you're on the best way in Poland to pass by the Netherlands. You will become number 5 in the next 2 or 3 years. I'm terribly sorry. So in the last 10 years, you grew your cheese production by 35%, from 640,000 tons in 2010 to close to 900,000 tons in 2020, more than 35%. And the Polish cheese export, so to the European Union or to third country, went up from 152,000 tons in 2010 to 260,000 tons in 2021, an increase of basically 75%. So you are the driving force, and that is true for milk production. Who's the driving force for milk production? We wouldn't increase the European milk production without 3 countries. It's Ireland, Italy, and first of all, it's Poland. All the other countries are stagnating. So you are the driving force, especially for cheese, and that has a historical reason. Whenever I show that slide in Italy, they are a bit surprised, but Poland is where the European cheese-making history starts. I'm not sure, I hope everybody here in Białystok is aware of that. The first traces we have found of cheese-making pottery is in Kujawi, which is about 600 kilometers southeast of here, in Poland. 7,500 years old pottery, the oldest pottery we ever found that was used by the Neolithic man to make cheese. The birthplace of cheese is Poland. Well, I have to do a disclaimer here. I'm not sure if the Neolithic people 7,500 years ago were already aware that this is Poland, but that's another story. But it is on Polish territory. That's an important thing. Back to trade. Sorry. Trade and hence trade policy really matters for the European dairy sector. Between 2016 and 2020, so the last 5 years, since we are implementing the European trade strategy, the extra EU 27 exports went up 20% for infant formula, 22% for cheese, and 36% for milk powders. The European trade strategy and trade policy are the fundament for that global success of EU dairy, and the EU trade strategy delivered. And that is a tweet from yesterday afternoon, half an hour after EU Commissioner Janusz Wojciechowski was live on screen here in the meeting. He published that tweet, though. The Polish EU Commissioner for Agriculture is proud of what the trade strategy delivers. And jointly, now the European Commission is revising its trade strategy. And that is a point where we as a European dairy community have to speak up. So you have to speak up to your Polish MEPs, you have to speak up to Mr. Puda, your Polish Minister of Agriculture, you have to speak up to your Polish Commissioner, Mr. Wojciechowski. When they set up the new trade strategy, what is important for us? It's defensive, protect our sensitive EU markets. It's offensive, seize opportunities and diversification in the world. And it's strategic, level playing field. Level playing field, for instance, having the same conditions when you ship a container of whey powder, of skimmed milk powder to China, you want to have the same tariff conditions than your competitors there, for instance. At a first glance, the new trade strategy, the plan to have a new trade strategy looks quite fair. That has been published in February 2021. Openness as a strategic choice, sustainability as a central pillar, and assertive in our action. So that looks quite nice, and that is a slide that I also copied from the EU Commission services. And I want to focus on the first point. Supporting the recovery and fundamental transformation of the EU economy in a way that is consistent with our green and digital ambitions. That is what the Commission said. The Commission said every legal action of Europe will be dominated by the Green Deal. Everything has to be aligned with the Green Deal Farm to Fork strategy that was on the agenda yesterday. And we had a deep dive yesterday into the challenges of the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategies. The measures that will be imposed on the European agriculture, European dairy industry are clear. We have, for the time being, 2 assessments of the impact, what that will translate into, and we had yesterday one from Lukas from IFCN, that was a brilliant one. They all tell us one, and we have one in the making. Together with Kopa Koshika, our friends from the Farmers and Cooperative Organization, Pekka was on the podium yesterday, we commissioned a study by the Wageningen University, because at the end of the day, dairy, you can't make dairy without the Dutch. So there are 2 public studies available, one from the European Parliament Research Center, one from the European Commission Research Center, and both tell us milk production in the European Union will go down by 10%. Milk production in the European Union will go down by 10%. We have right now a self-sufficiency of 112%. That would translate into a self-sufficiency of 100% if consumption keeps the way we are. And they all conclude, the 2 studies conclude, that milk costs, the costs of a dairy farmer like Carsten and his colleagues, by the way, you are honored, you have a delegation of German farmers here in the room that do a learning tour in Poland, and there's a private remark. 20 years ago, the German farmers came to invest in Poland. Today, they come to learn from Poland. That's what you achieved. So, and so the costs will go up by 15% for farms, for dairy farms. That's what they about conclude. We will present this study from the Wageningen University in an online conference on the 1st of October, and I will make sure that Agnieszka gets the key figures and can distribute it to the participants here. And we do believe, as European Dairy, that the trade policy can be a catalyst for sustainable development in the world. Trade has its role to play to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Yes, but we have to make it crystal clear, any unilateral approach by the EU bears the risk of a rather counterproductive response and a lack of fair level playing field with our competitors that will undermine our global pole position as European dairy when it comes to sustainability and global exports. And I think the presentation yesterday of Lukas from IFCN, by the way, I appreciated it that he as a Polish did it in English. That was great. That showed these figures. By the way, when you remember his presentation yesterday, he told you in 2030 we will export 30 million tons of milk from the European Union. Now, I don't believe we have 30 million tons to export because our milk production will most probably go down. Just as an example, in July 2021, 6 weeks ago, the EU Commission adopted a proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism in order to put a CO2 price on imported products. Okay? We touched on it yesterday in the opening session. So the Commission is aware, the European Union is aware that the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork, will put extra burden on some industries, and so whatever is imported will have to pay a levy when coming into the single market, what is imported from third countries. Now, in the first phases, only aluminium, steel, cement, electricity is concerned. Milk, dairy, agriculture is not concerned by that carbon border adjustment mechanisms. But our international trade partners and even the Secretary General of the World Trade Organization have already flagged up that such a system would be perceived as a way of green protectionism. And from our experience, not last with the Boeing Airbus case with the United States, we've learned, and we've learned the hard way, that the European agri-food and cheese business is always in the front line when it comes to trading partners that consider retaliation trade measures. So my call to the Polish lactosphere today is, today you are excelling. I mean, you are the one driving the European dairy lactosphere. You are producing more milk. You are number 6. You will become number 5 in global cheese. So you are extremely successful in uncorking the potential of the Polish dairy. You are successful in seizing the opportunities on the single market. And you are extremely good in taking all the opportunities in international trade. For the latest figures I've seen, but you will correct me, Mleczarska has 32% of all its milk, which is exported from Poland, 32% from Mleczarska, and Polmlek is over 50% of all milk produced that is exported outside Poland. But that are figures that I found on the internet. I know there are better experts in the room here. So there is no doubt that the European and the Polish lactosphere will adapt to any new environment, political environment in Europe and in Poland, even if this political environment is dominated by the European Green Deal. But this will take time and resources. And this cannot be done by cutting down our competitivity on global markets, by raising our prices, nor by opening up our European market for huge volumes of dairy imports from competing countries that profit from a better dairy trade environment than we do. And in preparation of the, and I know that Chris is eager to see that figures, in preparation of the discussion, I want to finish with that. I want you to keep that in mind. And these are figures that are cross-checked basically by our friends from New Zealand. So the free trade agreements are negotiated by the member states and the Commission. These are politicians. They have in mind the figures up there. What is dairy? 0.4% of the gross domestic product. So this is not important. When the European Commission puts out offers for market access to New Zealand, the Ministry of Agriculture is not even, the Ministries of Agriculture in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Poland, is mostly not even consulted. It's the Ministry of Economy who's doing that. And in the Ministry of Economy, dairy doesn't play a big role, let's face it. So we have less than 1% of the overall economy. The second figure is one where you see the top dairies of the continents of Europe, and you've seen that in 2019. I showed that in 2019 already. You see the weighted average for the top EU, top US, and top New Zealand dairies. By the way, in New Zealand, it's just one. And you see what part of their turnover they do in their comfort zone on the European Union, in the United States, in New Zealand, that is in green. And you see which part of their turnover comes from markets outside their comfort zone. And you see, we have a very balanced picture, 50%, almost 50% of the turnovers of the biggest, of the top 10 dairies in Europe come from outside Europe. In the United States, they are 13%. Another point for Lukasz from IFCN from the discussion yesterday, I believe he underestimated the US dairy potential. And for New Zealand, you see 90% of the turnover of New Zealand dairy stems from outside Europe market. You see also down there the timeline for free trade agreements that New Zealand negotiated. And again, if you have more than 10% of your national economy based on dairy, when you go into a free trade agreement negotiation, dairy has a weight. Dairy is important. So you see in 2008, they concluded already a free trade agreement with China. Back in February 2021, they negotiated back with China. They will phase out all import tariffs on powder, New Zealand powder to China within the next 3 years. So you see the competitive advantage that they have compared to you. Another one is the self-sufficiency. You see in the European Union we have about 112%. That may move according to all the figures we have. In Poland you are at 122% of self-sufficiency, or 123. In New Zealand you are above or around 800% of self-sufficiency. Last picture. but that will be made publicly available. It's, by the way, publicly available and cross-checked. You see the differences, the structural differences, for instance, with competing nations like New Zealand, where we just call the Commission to pay attention on the dairy sector. You can't, and I refer to the call of Pekka Pessonen yesterday, you can't impose burdens on European agriculture, European dairy by the Green Deal, making dairy production, milk production in Europe more expensive, and at the same time opening up our markets in huge volumes for third country competitors that may not have the same restrictions. And the last thing, I wanted to make some promotion. Yesterday in the second session, there were so much promotion, so I thought 2 minutes of self-promotion is good. On Friday, 1st of October, we have an online seminar where we will disclose the study of the Wageningen University, Professor Roel Jongeren, on the impact of the Green Deal farm-to-fork strategy on European dairy. And with that, dziękuję bardzo. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here in Poland. Thank you.
Dziękujemy pięknie.
Thank you very much.
Bardzo ważne dane dotyczące rynku mleka, handlu i szczególnie poruszyły nasze serca te fotki z polską reprezentacją, która wczoraj zremisowała z Anglią 1-1 i wszyscy Polacy są szczęśliwi, ponieważ potencjał naszego zespołu chyba jeszcze nie jest gotowy na to, żeby pokonać drużynę angielską, wicemistrzów Europy. Bardzo dziękujemy, panie sekretarzu. I chciałbym poprosić teraz Chrisa Carsona, radcę rolnego przy stałym przedstawicielstwie Nowej Zelandii w Brukseli, aby przedstawił nam perspektywy handlu międzynarodowego, skutków umów o wolnym handlu. Zapraszam. We are looking for a remote control. Alexander, could you give us? Okay.
That one. Okay. Perfect. Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to thank you all for being here after last night. It was a very good function last night, and I'd especially like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to be able to present on behalf of New Zealand. So thank you, Agnieszka. It's the opportunity is really good. In my short presentation today, what I intend to do is talk a little bit about how New Zealand views trade, and specifically, well, not specifically in dairy products across the board, but I will focus on dairy products, and also look at the current opportunities and challenges the way that we see them. And I'll talk a little bit about the New Zealand-EU FTA as well. And I might pick up a couple of Alexander's comments. It's going to be interesting because I'm quoting some of the same sources as he quoted, but maybe I'll do it in a slightly different way. Firstly, can I just express sympathies for those that have been affected by the COVID pandemic. I sort of hoped that we wouldn't see that sort of personal or economic disruption in our lifetimes, but unfortunately we have. Hopefully things are getting better. One thing about the pandemic, though, is it has reinforced the need for countries to work together on problems. And we know that with respect to vaccines, for example, but we also know with respect to climate change, biodiversity, and a lot of other issues, countries have to work together. And in fact, it's no different in the international trade sense, and that's one thing I'm going to pick up. The agricultural trade has shown remarkable resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic. There were issues, as I'm sure you're well aware, with closed borders within Europe at the beginning of the pandemic, but that was quickly resolved. And this chart shows agricultural trade and non-agricultural trade. It's in index form, so the scale is not right, but the blue line showing agricultural trade, this is on a monthly basis since December 2019. So agriculture trade has actually gone up. One thing I would like to point to is in the red or orange line, the big fall in non-agricultural exports from the EU at the beginning of the pandemic. And that is EU data. It was even more pronounced in China, United States, and other markets. And it is that big fall in non-agricultural trade which is causing now many of the problems that we see in international logistics, shipping, availability of containers, and so on. And that is because trade is now trying to catch up, and there are some real issues I know facing New Zealand exporters just getting the ability to get our product out of the country. Just one thing, and I think Alexander mentioned this, and a number of speakers did yesterday as well. With or without a pandemic, trade is essential. No country is ever going to be self-sufficient, whether it is in food, agricultural inputs, energy, or technology. Trade is essential. And global food security relies on products crossing the borders, and the estimate is that 20% of all food eaten around the world crosses an international border. And when you think about it, that's quite a significant amount. Alexander mentioned this, and others have as well, but the global demand is strong for dairy products. This slide is based on OECD and FAO data, and looking at projections through to 2030, and dairy is one of the very few agricultural products that is forecast to have strong demand growth. That demand growth is shown in the slide in terms of 1,000 tons, I think, yes, that's right. So one thing that's particularly interesting is cheese, and again this has been talked about already, but the OECD FAO forecasts the demand increase for cheese from developing countries to be about 300,000 tons, more than 300,000 tons, and also a demand increase for cheese of about 280,000 tons from developed countries. And through the modelling exercises that they did, they forecast that EU cheese production in that period will increase by around 1 million tonnes. So that's the expectation of the economic modelers of the OECD and FAO. And Poland is mentioned specifically in that report as one of the emerging players on the global market. And again, that picks up some of the things we've heard about before. At the same time though, a lot of food is not traded. A lot of food, most food is consumed in country. And I've been living in Brussels now for a couple of years, and there's been a lot of talk about short supply chains versus trade and so on. But to us, it isn't a case of short supply chains versus trade. We need both. They are both complementary. This photo, by the way, the photo on the left shows the New Zealand Minister of Agriculture tasting cheese at a small cheese market in New Zealand. And I think the photo on the right is a farmer's market in Poland. Turning to New Zealand, we are a small country in terms of population, only about 5 million people, and we're separated from our nearest neighbour by about 2,500 kilometres. We have a difficult topography in terms of it is very hilly and mountainous, but we have a benign climate, and those two things together mean that grass grows effectively almost year-round, and 55% roughly of New Zealand is in permanent grassland. I would just pick up on one point that Alexander wrongly made about New Zealand, and that is dairy is not 10% of GDP. That's probably the whole of agriculture. Dairy accounts for closer, I think, to about 3.5, maybe 4% of GDP. But point still taken. So our topography, our farming systems mean that our production capacity is limited. It's limited by the amount of grass that grows on farms. We do not really feed grains or oil seeds to livestock. In fact, we don't produce basically any oil seeds at all and very little grain. So it would not be economically profitable to increase production through feeding those products to animals. We are a relatively small producer, but because of our small population, we are a significant exporter, as the charts showed. And that means we rely on international markets. We are strong supporters of the World Trade Organization, and as I'm sure you know, the World Trade Organization is under a lot of pressure at the moment. The appellate body has been gutted, and the negotiating function has not really progressed at all for the last 20 years, and that's a real problem. The EU's recent trade policy review that Alexander quoted recognizes this as well. The WTO is also a very important part of the EU policy. And these are the EU objectives for the WTO. So restoring trust, restoring the dispute settlement system, more effective negotiations, and addressing imbalances in commitments, transparency and monitoring, and so on. And so, to be honest, that could be the New Zealand brief for the WTO organization as well. And one particular area where we have common interests is making sure that our agricultural producers, our dairy farmers, compete on a level playing field. This shows the subsidies going to dairy products from a few countries, and we only have data of a few countries. This is OECD data, but subsidies going to dairy products in a number of the emerging economies. They go up and down because it depends a bit on world prices and things, but I think the direction is pretty clear that the emerging markets are quite rapidly increasing their subsidization of dairy. And that is an area where the EU and New Zealand have to work together in the WTO to try and put limits around those countries. The EU's trade policy talks about commitments on domestic support being a priority, and the EU says that it is in favour of a substantial reduction in trade-distorting domestic support. New Zealand doesn't have any trade-distorting domestic support. We got rid of subsidies a number of years ago, and the EU has obviously reformed its subsidies. It used to be very trade-distorting back in the early 90s, for example, but now most of the EU subsidies are non-trade support and distorting. Like New Zealand, the EU has embarked on FTAs, as we just heard about as well. And I have picked up this slide from the recent cumulative impact of FTAs report that the European Union did. And that study showed a positive cumulative impact from FTAs, the FTA program of the EU, including those FTAs under negotiation like New Zealand. This slide shows the dairy aspect of it, showing with and without FTAs, and the orange bit on the end of those lines reflects the impact of FTAs. So what it shows is the FTAs that are in effect and the ones that have been negotiated at the moment will lead to further exports of dairy from the European Union, some further imports of dairy, but that's a pretty small line, you probably can't see it from there. But the overall trade balance is very favourable for dairy. And to be honest, that's similar to our own experience with FTAs. FTAs are not a zero-sum game. They are trade creating. So it isn't just a matter of taking product out of one market and putting in another. It actually leads to further trade, increases in trade elsewhere. This is a map, and like all New Zealand maps, it has New Zealand in the middle of it, and Europe's way up on one side and the US way up on the other, but the important country is right in the middle. It shows our current FTAs that are in force, and it shows our FTAs that we are negotiating. I won't go through the ones that are in force because Alexander's slide had it. The key one, for example, was China since 2008. I suppose just a couple of more recent ones, the so-called Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, which brings together 11 countries, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which brings together the ASEAN countries along with China and Korea. Those mega FTAs are very important to us. And they are not only about market access, but they are also about aligning standards. And that is very important from a trade facilitation point of view. The closer we can get to similar standards with other countries, the less non-tariff barriers, SPS barriers, and so on that we face. And there's a lot of interest in those mega FTAs, and you probably know that the United Kingdom has indicated that it wants to join the CPTPP. About 70% of New Zealand's trade, by the way, is covered by those FTAs at the moment. We are also negotiating an FTA with the EU, and we're very excited about that. The EU accounts for about 13% of our trade. That's not dairy, but that's our total trade from New Zealand. In many ways, we are very suited as partners. We have similar values around human rights, labour, and the environment. We both take climate and sustainability very seriously. The EU has shown that through its Farm to Fork strategy and the Green Deal that we've heard a lot about. We have similar programs in place in New Zealand, particularly in the sustainability and climate change area. One of our New Zealand programs is going to result in a price that farmers will have to pay for their agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the methane from animals and nitrous oxide from land. Farmers will have to pay, if you like, a carbon tax, a levy for their emissions in that area. We also, as EU and New Zealand, have very high animal welfare standards, some of the best in the world. And we also have a very long and strong trading relationship and investment relationship that will set us up for the future. 11 rounds of negotiation have already taken place. Our trade minister was also, and agriculture minister, the same person, was also in Brussels in June and met with Commissioner Wojciechowski and also with Executive Vice President Dombrovskis. and Alexander as well. That was another meeting that he had. We are making a lot of progress. There's very good momentum. 3 market access offers have been exchanged, and we hope to conclude as soon as possible. The one area that is outstanding still is receiving from the EU a commercially meaningful offer on some of our key products, including some dairy products, not many, but some dairy products, sheep meat, beef, and wine. So we are still waiting to see what the EU proposes in that area. But we are confident that the FTA will be concluded soon, and I think once it is, it will be a world-leading FTA. It will enhance the relationship and our ability to work together, and also including working together on some of those NTBs that we are facing in third country markets as well. So I think I'll stop there, but as I said, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion, and I'll hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To była perspektywa Nowej Zelandii, standaryzacja.
This was the perspective of New Zealand. Standardization, unification required for more fluent trade exchange, and now the Spanish perspective, Mr. Gabriel Tezando Falcon, Director for Production Sectors, European Union and International Cooperation.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Agnieszka, for the invitation to be here. Thank you to everybody on your team for the charming welcoming yesterday, which made a lot of people maybe are not still here. But so after the 2 speakers we have listened this morning, I'm now going to speak about dairy sector. I'm going to speak in a broader aspect in the international level. You are all professional. You know what the challenge we have in the future for the international trade. And my intention is that to open some debates and some questions from the Spanish perspective, of course, about the international trade. But first of all, let's see if, okay. I would like to introduce who I am representing, who is working for. I'm working for the Spanish Agri-Food Cooperative, which means more than 3,000 farming cooperative, more than 1 million members, families who are owners of the cooperative, with a turnover in the last data we have available of 35 billion euros and more than 111,000 employees directly, and not counting, taking into account the employees in our farmers in a way. So Spain is a large country, is a large producing country. If you were taking all the producing sectors, we are the 8th producing country in the world at global level. However, as you know, the message I would like to send to you here is that even if you are exporter, or you are importer, or whatever you are, international trade and global market is inside you. We are not very important. I mean, we are not self-sufficient in dairy production. We only produce 60% of our needs. But of course, the price and the profitability is really linked to European Union market and international trade too. So we have in Spain all producing sectors. When I say all, it's all. So we have continental, arable crops, livestock sector, intensive, extensive, tropical, fruit and vegetables, Mediterranean countries. And of course, if we're taking into account the European Union level, we are one of the 4th largest exporters, and we represent more or less 10.4% of the European Union exporter. If taking into account Brexit, Poland is already one of the 7 largest exporter economies inside the European Union. But you must know that only those countries, the 7 first exporting countries, represent the 70% of the trade global, the exporters' economy at the agri-food level. We are, as Pekka Pesonen said yesterday, the first economic sector contributing to the general economy in terms of trade. So I will show you later what is the importance of this trade balance. And of course, in some sectors, we are completely leaders of fruit and vegetables, olive, meat, especially in pig meat sector and sheep meat sector, especially after the Brexit, because he was the first producer of sheep meat in Europe, and wine. So as you see here, since 2008, let's say we say 2008 is the start of the war after the big crisis, economic crisis. As you see here, the trade balance in agri-food sector is increasing year by year. I think after Brexit, it will continue to be even grower next year and the other. If we take into account European Union trade and world trade, so we have a difference. Of course, when we speak from the state perspective, member state perspective, we always speak about export when we are talking internal market. But internal market is not export. But okay, we take into account that data, especially to take into account as well the effect of the Brexit. But our main customers in European Union are France, Germany, and Italy. At global level, of course, the first one by large is United Kingdom, and it will be in the next few years, of course. China, especially booming by the pig meat export in Spain, and of course, United States, albeit all these problems in the last few years with these all duties we have suffering in the last 3 years, especially in some Mediterranean products we know better. So what do you represent Spanish, the global trade, the Spanish global trade in cooperative? We have identified that already 30% of our turnover come from the trade outside Spain, European Union, and international trade too. And if we make a balance between them, it's more or less 60% is European Union, 40% already is third countries. So, but after the data, and after to analysis the macroeconomic data about trade, I think all professionals, that's our challenge, is how to analyze this, in behind. Because we cannot have a real picture if we want to make a debate for the future if we don't know how that affects to our farmers, industries, and market. And that's because we have identified from the Spanish perspective real challenge for the future and for the debate when we are talking about international level. Sorry, but it's not connected the computer to. Okay. I think I have lost my presentation here. No? Well. So, first element to take into account. Pekka Pesonen yesterday talked about governance and legal uncertainty. Okay, so one of the first challenges is, do we have a level playing field? Do we have an international government? Of course, with the WTO negotiations, where it's completely overcome. I mean, the basis that we negotiate in WTO are completely overcome. It's not enough for today. And of course, in the international free trade agreements, we have a lot of problems in the trade, in the day by day. This morning, Alexander spoke about the competence of the European Commission, European Union in order to negotiate free trade agreements. But when you negotiate the free trade agreements at the European Commission, European Union, of course, because they take the decisions, after, like a company, you have to go, okay, and to export. And we find certain elements, like export protocols, that makes that the free trade agreements maybe is not enough. And you have to renegotiate by country and by product. And this is special, it is really special importance in certain products like fruit and vegetable. We have more than 4,000 international protocols that it makes that free trade agreements in certain sectors are not enough. For example, in Japan, which is very valuable for everybody in fruit and vegetable, is not enough because you cannot export European fruit and vegetables to Japan, to make an example. So export protocol, level playing field, and governance, there are 3 elements very important for the future. Another question, Brexit. Brexit, it makes you an idea, that's because it's important to understand that European Union, of course, is a market, is the most important global market in the world. But it's not a political union for the time being, that is lacking as well. So after Brexit, of course, we are regarding the importance of to be integrated. This year, European Union we have increased, export to United Kingdom. It's not because Brexit is good for us. It is because United Kingdom, UK, is not able to control borders for the time being. But on the other way, when UK wants to come to European Union and the free market agreement is already active, so they have lost like near 40% of export to the European Union. So when the controls will start next year or maybe the other, we will see for the European Union producers and trade what are the real impact of Brexit in our economy. The other question is reciprocity. That's somebody called now mirroring. We need a level playing field and we need reciprocity. And sometimes it is not the same, because level playing field is we have all the same rules. But after that, you have to develop a set of questions that they are not all the time inside the negotiations, the trade negotiations. For example, in WTO, I know you are sure you remember, a few years ago when we were talking WTO, we don't speak about no market questions. So what are the main questions now? It's a no market questions: environment, durable production model. So reciprocity is something else. If we go further in these sustainability strategies and our partners, they don't do the same, we will have a problem on reciprocity, maybe, and we will have a level playing field. Okay? Environmental sustainability is a challenge, opportunity, or threat. Alexander, really, I don't know. But of course, for the companies, when you are competing with other companies, we need the same rules and as well reciprocity. So if we will get the same rules for the future, it will be an opportunity, because we have to count international trade not only by volume but as well by value. So we need a fair competition. So the key question for the future: how can we get that? And of course, what happened in the middle? Because we know clearly what we want. We want a political objective. We want to arrive here, but nobody is speaking about how can we get it. Our challenge is European Union single entity. So if we negotiate the free trade agreements or WTO in one voice, we are strong. If we go to negotiate every country by itself, to China, to United States, to New Zealand, I can assure you that the real life of the trade stakeholders, it will be very difficult. So we need a single entity to negotiate and to manage in the future the trade agreements. Because if not, it will be very difficult to get this level playing field or this reciprocity. And especially, for example, the most important example for the Spanish perspective is what we have with the Trump administration, with this tax we have suffered over table olive oil, which was completely unfair, but they were there. So we lost like 30% of the market in only 3 years. And this is a net exporter sector. So, as I said in the future, at the beginning of the presentation, even if you are exporter, you're really weak in international atmosphere if you don't have real legal certainty. And finally, this is my main message. We are cooperative. We are owned by farmers. If we identify or we analyze this global trade only in terms of macroeconomic data, we really forget what is important for us. All this added value created by the international trade reach the producers. We speak about, a lot in European Union about SMEs, small and medium enterprise. How many farmers do we have here? How many farmers do they have a farm over 3 million euros turnover? Because 3 million euro turnover is a small company. And to be in the international trade, you need to be really big. You need to have a strategy in the long run. It's complicated. So how can we get the international trade reach the farmers? And that's the main challenge for us. And sometimes when we speak about CAP, when we speak about trade, when we speak about consistency, this is the main questions we have to answer if we want to say to our people, okay, this is good for everybody. In Spain, we have net exporter sectors, but as well, at the dairy sector, we have net importers. And even for the exporter sector, my president is here. He's a pig meat producer. And of course, for him, it's very important the trade, the global trade. But it's very important as well to have a import the imports in order to pay the feeding staff. Because if we don't have import of feeding, we are not self-sufficient in cereals, on feeding staff. So it will be impossible to maintain our position in the future. So I see here, I need to finish. So this is more or less I wanted to say, and I would like to, Paul, thank you very much, Agnieszka, for the invitation, and I would like to participate later in the debate and to, to give all my inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Więcej szczegółów w panelu dyskusyjnym, który przed nami. Zapraszam panią Monikę Przeworską. Będzie można podyskutować o przepływie.
Discussion panel, and you will have an opportunity to discuss trade flow, standardization, and other aspects. And I'd like to invite now my guest, my panelists. So now I'd like to invite Alexandre Anton as a panelist, and Chris Carson, yes, please come on to the stage, and Gabrielle, and two ladies who are agricultural counselors, Caroline Spans and Marie-Christine Legal. So now please take your seats here on stage as panelists.
Yes. Szanowni Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much for your presentations. So all lecturers started their presentation with, let's say, thanks for yesterday's evening. Well, I think it is really so, because it was an exceptional evening. We managed to meet each other in person, to exchange our views and to spend some time together. And it is particularly important because throughout the last year we were deprived of such possibility. The fact that we were unable to meet is one aspect, but unfortunately what the coronavirus pandemic caused was big economic losses in many sectors. There were great losses in terms of value, and now great chapeau bas for everyone who's here in the conference who represent the dairy sector. You really were able to manage all these things, you were efficient, and that's why your sector did not experience the distortions of supply chains. That's why milk was really collected from farms. And we've heard a very interesting presentation of trade agreements and their effects. In his presentation, Chris also mentioned that we should put emphasis on both aspects, that is trade agreements and sales in short chains, direct sales. And as what we heard yesterday from our Commissioner on Agriculture, unfortunately he very often emphasizes that we must remodel European agriculture and somehow shift to production exclusively based on short supply chains. The most important question is how the
dostaw może zmienić oblicze europejskiego i światowego rolnictwa. I to pytanie może zaczniemy od pana Chrisa.
You are the first. Sorry, we had technical problem.
Jeśli mogę kogoś prosić.
So, if I may, there is not a level playing field because the French translation for Marie-Christine for me is very working.
Muszę powiedzieć, że niestety mamy nierówne warunki gry dla Chris.
And I just wanted, if I may, Monica, to thank Chris for having corrected me. I do apologize. Indeed, we had a short discussion. I showed you a slide where I said what is true is the overall European agricultural sector is accounting for 1.5% of the GDP, so the dairy sector is about 0.4%. And for the New Zealand figures, the 10% seems to be quite too high. So I do apologize, Chris, and we come back. We will, as always, agree on our figures. and publish the correct figures. I'm grateful for that. And I wanted to say thank you to Chris for his presentation, because indeed he's right. New Zealand and the European Union have values in common. It's a bit tricky to talk about, to name the human rights issues here, because that is exactly the reason why we don't have a free trade agreement as a European Union with China. So that is a bit tricky, but indeed, and I wanted to highlight here that we have, as European Dairy Community, as European Dairy Association, an excellent working relation with Fonterra, the number one dairy company in New Zealand. They were really instrumental and helpful when it comes to tackle the environmental issues. They have been one of the powerhouses when we established the European dairy product environmental footprint at global level, and that I wanted to highlight, Chris. And now I think the translation works better, right?
Marii, zapytajmy może w takim razie Marii. Marii, jesteś radcą w wielu państwach. Wiesz, jak wygląda struktura rolna.
Marie, you are an agricultural counselor, so you know the structure of agriculture in many countries. So what is your experience? What do you think about kind of manual and shifting to the reduction of supply chains? Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Thank you for today's invitation. Agnieszka, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here with you today. And now it would be easier for me in English.
I think it's a good idea, but it's not for everyone. We all hear about this shortening of the supply chain. It's not a new idea, but it's an idea that we are pushing more and more, and hearing from the Commissioner Wojciechowski quite a lot. And it's a good idea because indeed it answers a demand from consumers to have more local products, to have more less transportation, more environmentally friendly. So I think it's in this way it's a good idea, but it does not mean that there is no room for everyone and for other type of products and for more convenient products that are exported widely. So I think shortening the supply chain is a good idea for some products that we have to go in this direction, but it does not mean that you have to oppose shortening the supply chain and big export. Export for worldwide export for dairy product is still the future for some convenience products. So there is room for everyone, for GI products, for niche production, and also for widely distributed products. So one does not exclude the other.
Exactly so, ladies and gentlemen. However, while discussing here FTAs, it is important to keep common standards, to implement the same standards. The question is how Polish producers, or generally European agricultural producers, can find themselves in the world where all the data published and yesterday discussed, like by especially representatives of Copa Cogeca, that show that the competitiveness of European agriculture will go down. So the question is, will we be able to compete on foreign markets, and how, in that case, we should conclude these FTAs? Marie, this is a question to you too. Sorry, no, Caroline, sorry.
First of all, indeed, thank you very much also, Agnieszka, for having us here today and for this very interesting forum. Well, can we still compete on foreign markets? I think the answer on that question is of course. First of all, I think it's also about innovation. You need to find the new products. And as Alexander was already mentioning, you cannot make dairy without the Dutch. But I think you can also not innovate without the Dutch, because indeed we have Wageningen University. And they are also working on new products with proteins. For example, when people go older, they need more proteins, and they are looking into new ways for applications of dairy proteins. So I think these kinds of new types of products are very valuable on other markets. And also not on all markets the price is the first driver. For example, in Japan, it's only issue number 5. So I think also we will see an increase of the export to Japan, for example, also with the free trade agreement?
W prezentacji Chrisa jasno zostało opisane.
Presentation to give clear description of now negotiated agreements, though that has not taken effect, and those that would soon be in force. Some of them are a great opportunity for the European sector. So, however, some we will have to treat as a threat. And the question is, which support do you expect? Because many times you mentioned that while that who is negotiating is bureaucrats. It is not us who farmers, processors negotiate. Somehow someone else negotiates for us. So another question is, which support does the industry expect? I mean, the European dairy sector expects so that to make trade safe and fair. So that is the question mainly to Gabriel.
Well, thank you. I think, as I said in my presentation, the question sometimes we lose in data. Okay, so the question is how we negotiate this. So, of course, all the sectors, dairy, all the sectors, they need reciprocity. They need a level playing field. We need to understand when we negotiate, we exchange industry for agricultural products, and we have, let's say, offensive and defensive, and so on. But the question is not how you negotiate the result. That's, of course, we need in the future, level playing field, reciprocity, and so on, is how we manage, and after, how we make policies in order to compensate this imbalance we are going to create. Because for the time being, I'm going to be clear. When I hear my commissioner, Wojciechowski, saying yesterday that the success of the trade policy is because the CAP, well, I'm not quite sure of that. I mean, CAP is 70% of dairy payments, decoupled for production. So we have a margin of maneuver to create new tools in order to attack this imbalance created by the loyal negotiations, where we are losers and winners.
Szanowni Państwo, jeszcze jedna ważna kwestia.
One more important issue. You all remember what happened in August 2014 when the Russian Federation blocked exports of agri-food products from the European Union. So the sector hardest hit was the dairy sector at the time. So as the last years show, the sector really coped well in the situation. Production increased, producers still produced, and the revenues of farmers did not fall so much as we had assumed earlier, but unfortunately it had a different effect. The effect is that the Russian Federation and the East became a great power now. If we talk to the companies that manufacture machines, also connected with milk kettle production, they point out to the fact that it was Europe several years ago, machinery was sold, but now, unfortunately, it changed. Such machinery is mainly now sold to the Russian Federation. Therefore, next to us, we see a great partner, trading partner, maybe in future, emerging. So maybe should we treat such an emerging partner as a threat? Because Asian markets are those markets which should be of great interest to all of us. The question is the strengthened position of the Russian Federation in this area a threat to us? And I guess it's a question to all of you.
I don't think that, well, it's, as you say, it's a big competitor for us, of course, but one strength of, one of the multiple strengths of the EU production is our sanitary quality. We have high sanitary standards that are worldwide known. And you were speaking about Asian markets and the importance of Asian markets, and Asian consumers want EU products, especially because they want this quality. So a lot of farmers told me that in a way vet services are sometimes a pain because they're coming to farms, coming to industries, doing controls and supervision. And I understand the administrative burden that it can be on day-to-day basis, but they also told me that it's a chance for them because when they export, they know that they have this certification from EU vet services, and that it's very important, and that helps the export. And in this way, I think we are way above the Russian competitors.
Maybe if I can say something here from a New Zealand point of view. Firstly, Russia was in that slide that I put up on the screen about one of the countries that is increasing its subsidies to its dairy sector, and that is a threat, and it would be very good if we, EU and New Zealand, can work together in the WTO and try and control that. But I think the point made about quality is a very important one, and the strength of the Asian markets. I think we underestimate that. A lot of New Zealand exports go to China at the moment, but there are lots of other countries in China as well. There's a latent demand there for high quality dairy products, whether they are from New Zealand, the EU, or, as quite a few of the dairy products now, a mixture of both. There is a strong demand there. So Russia as a market itself, obviously it's a very difficult market for Europe with the sanctions. It is also a very difficult market for New Zealand. It's not a big market for us, and it's likely to get smaller over time. But I think the focus on the Asian markets, there's a lot of demand there. New Zealand and the EU are the two largest dairy exporters in the world, and I think there is a great opportunity there. EU is obviously a far bigger producer of dairy than we are. As I said during the presentation, we are a significant exporter.
Gabriel?
Well, Russian situation is the typical example that would happen when we don't have a governance at the international level. It is going to happen in the next few years because we have a serious stakeholder in the market that they don't believe in multilateral agreements or on rules. That's life, and we have to live with that. But saying that, we have to say, I think Carson said in his presentation, international global trade only represents 10% of global exchanges. Okay, so of course we need to focus as well on who are our partners, to whom we can trade in the fair basis, to agree in the future production model. I think New Zealand could be agree on that as well. We will discuss it, and especially to know what is going to be the value of the future trade, not only the volume in the future trade we are facing in this basis. But I don't believe in the next few years Russia and maybe China, it will be a good partner for the future. Just not because they are not good or bad. It is because the way of they take the decisions, which is surprisingly from one year to other, they can block or they can develop one market.
And if I may, very shortly, I've been to dairy conferences in Tbilisi, Georgia, and Kiev, Ukraine, where the discussion is not about the threat of Russia in the dairy market, but the threat of Russia all short. But anyway, I agree that for the dairy, they do invest into dairy. The Russians have realized the potential they have. Will they threat us for the next 20 years? I can't see that. And here again, I want to praise Chris and his team, because when you talked about the Russian embargo, 6th of August 2014, UCAS 561, to be very precise, the first call I did get was from Chris and his team, because they were not on the list. They were not on the list. They could have said, now let's go into Russia, let's take all the Russian market and kick the Europeans out. And the first call we did get was indeed from the New Zealand embassy to tell us, listen, how do we organize that? How can we organize that together? And so they were really, though that was really a proof of the honest approach that the Kiwis have. and I want to pay tribute to that. And as I said, there is the Russian dairy is developing greatly, but for the safety aspects, I agree with Marie-Christine and Caroline there. They will not be close to a threat. On China, by the way, the Chinese feel that they are dependent on dairy imports, and they don't like to be dependent at all. So if you talk to bigger European producers, the Chinese feel especially dependent on the whole milk powder from New Zealand, because we don't produce that in Europe at the scale that New Zealand is producing a whole milk powder. And the Chinese would like us, would like to be more independent from their New Zealand whole milk powder imports, and they would like to see Europeans step up producing whole milk powders to limit the dependency here on one player. And here again, New Zealand and the European Union are well advised to work together, because this is a geopolitical strategic advantage we have. We don't have many geopolitical strategic advantages vis-à-vis China, neither New Zealand nor the European Union. One of these little strategic advantages is our dairy capacity, because they need us there. And there, being close to our friends in New Zealand here is an advantage.
Since yesterday, we've been discussing greatly the European Green Deal and the real effects of it. We regret very much that there is no official commission on all effects of these strategies, that is bio-strategy or farm-to-farm strategy. However, yesterday, we saw many threats and challenges to farmers. Many of them, to farmers especially. And Alexander also clearly stated in his presentation today that we must consider a 10% drop in production, about 15% increase in production costs. And it is an important message from this forum. I mean, this data will translate into one thing. Everything will be more expensive. Retail products will be more expensive. Farm gate price of milk will go up. So the question is, where is the interest of producer here? Is there a chance or a possibility that it will be necessary to launch kind of over-standard European Commission measures so that to compensate for farmers' losses? And this is a question to all of you. So let's start with Caroline.
I know we speak a lot about threats, but I think within the CAP and Farm to Fork, there are also many opportunities, first of all. Growing towards more sustainability and also having the funds partly available, I have to say partly available within CAP, can also provide the opportunities, for example, to invest in animal welfare or to invest in other sustainable production. And I think with the increase of the prices, it's also very important that we pay a fair income to the farmer. So if indeed the consumer would maybe need to pay a bit more because the farmer is investing in sustainability, I'm not sure whether that's really a bad issue. So I'd like to see more into opportunities than only in threats. And I think we can see maybe other threats or other issues, such as increasing cost of labor, or finding also the right people actually to work in the dairy sector or in general in agriculture. We can see an increase in energy cost. So maybe also, for example, with the energy cost, if you would invest more into green energy, maybe you can actually lower there, for example, the production cost. And I don't see market interventions as the way in general to protect a market. I think it's also for the farmer and for the whole dairy industry to look at the business model and to re-estimate that business model, what is right. And market interventions should not be the first thing to think about.
Thanks. I quite agree with you, Caroline. And well, I think that Director Pleva was also very clear yesterday about export subsidies, and it's the past now. It's in the past. And I wanted just to add to what Caroline just said, a few words about also cooperatives and contracts and risk management, because it's also part of how to get a better price, better income for farmers. It's also for the sector to, as you said, to build another strategy, and also how to manage risk when you're a farmer, and how to, we had yesterday an interesting presentation about risk management and how to guarantee an income, a stable income through months and years, and I think that's also part of the future.
So the question is, we have to adapt to the 10% production less. I will say we will have an imbalanced market if we don't change the things with 10% less of production. That's the first question. Okay, so it's a more complex debate. Environment and sustainability. If we produce public goods, so if we produce public goods, by definition, it's not paid by consumer. It's paid for the chain, especially farmers. Okay, so if we only speak in the future, only more obligations and conditioning, of course we will have higher cost, and it will be even more painful if we reduce 10%, of course, production. And third, market intervention, I agree, it is not an objective, but it's a tool. If we don't take into account in the future, you know, this challenging study of more cost is costly, and the market will continue to work with no rules, or we do something, and of course we'll have more imbalance, because we have global trade, we have the balance in the food chain, the farmers is the weakest position, and of course it takes real immediately economic consequences. So that's it will be my response. It's more complex, but I think we need to take into account all this stuff in order to, let's say, read, you know, this impact assessment that we have. The first thing they have said is we are not able to make a full impact assessment because we cannot take into account all the elements in the future.
Thank you. It's not really my place to be commenting on the farm to fork and Green Deal. The one thing I would say, or a couple of things I will say, is that is the regulatory side of it. I think what our producers, not only in dairy but in other products, are finding as well, is similar demands are coming from the consumers anyway. So even if the farm to fork or other regulatory measures aren't there, I think the direction of travel in terms of sustainability is clear. And I think there are opportunities. We don't have farm to fork, obviously. We don't have intervention, we don't have payments for public goods. And as I said during my presentation, we're actually going to put a price on farmers' emissions of methane, etc. But that will be part of the cost of doing business. What I would note is that we have found over the years that farmers are very innovative. If they are given the tools, they can find a way of increasing their profits, increasing their returns from the farm. And I haven't looked at those studies closely, but I would be surprised if production fell by that extent. I mean, there are increases in performance from animals the whole time through genetic selection. There are other innovative practices that farmers can take to keep farming if they are given the tools to do so and the advice to do so. And certainly this issue has come up in New Zealand as well because of our own regulations, and that is the response from our farmers groups. You know, tell us what results you want and leave it to us to try and deliver it for you. Thank you.
Happy are the New Zealand farmers. They have, because we all in the European and the Polish lactose favor, we would be happy, and we all subscribe to the overall ambition and goals of the European Commission to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. That's a given. Everybody's okay with that. And the New Zealand farmers, as we just have learned, have the freedom of operation. They can choose the way to get there, while we face the risk in Europe to get it imposed by us, by 120 regulatory initiatives by the European Commission and the European Parliament that tackle dairy and the way to zero emissions here. That's on that one. And then when we talk about increasing prices, it doesn't help if Pavel from Lekpol decides to pay out 10% higher milk prices. It doesn't help the farmer if the costs go up 15%. It doesn't help the milk price, doesn't help the costs go up. And since we are on the panel on international trade, I mean, we just talked about Poland being number 6 in global cheese production, and who says cheese says whey, and there are specific whey products and specific other dairy products in the high-end market, premium market, where you can include the sustainability costs, where you can have the margin to do so. But when we are talking international trade in dairy, we mainly talk about bulk, we talk about butter and powder, especially to China. And I don't see the Chinese to pay an extra money for standard European whey powder because we have an animal-friendly production. I don't see that. And that is a premium that is paid on the single market, maybe on the single market, on the European market, maybe in some premium markets like Japan. Gabriel touched on that one. But I don't believe that in the international trade arena, we will not get rewarded for that effort. And as we've seen, Poland has a self-sufficiency of 123% in dairy. We are dependent, European Union 112, New Zealand 800. We are dependent on international market, so we depend on the international competitivity, and I can't see that sustainability or animal welfare is paid in the international market.
Bardzo dziękuję. Szanowni Państwo, myślę, że to jest też doskonała okazja, żeby zadać pytania.
And it's a great opportunity to ask questions to all the lecturers. So is there anyone from the floor, from the public now who would like to ask a question? If not, so thank you very much. Thank you so much for your participation in the panel.
Pięknie dziękujemy Pani Moniko, dziękujemy wszystkim panelistom.
I'd like to thank first of all the panelists, and now let's have the first coffee break. We deserved it. So we will have break until 11. You have time to rest, to refresh, to talk on the margin of the conference, and let's get back at 11.